From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Afghanistan. There's a lot to discuss, from the recent US-Taliban agreement and the political power struggle over the presidency to the challenges facing the intra-Afghan dialogue and the effects of coronavirus. Thankfully, we've got three great guests on today's program to help us make sense of what's going on and where things might be headed. Marvin Weinbaum, Vanda Felbab-Brown, and Michael Kugelman. Marvin is the head of MEI's Afghanistan and Pakistan program. Vanda is a senior fellow in the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence in the Foreign Policy program at Brookings. Michael is the deputy director of the Asia program and senior associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. Marvin, Vanda, Michael, thank you all for joining us today and welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marvin, I want to start with you and the US-Taliban deal signed on February 29th. What, in broad brushstroke terms, does the deal involve, and what were your kind of key takeaways from it?
Well, we know that it has specified a 14-month departure of seemingly all American troops, graduated and supposedly condition-based, although what the criteria for that is at least not known to us. There are these two annexes, which are secret, and conceivably they define that, but we have no indication of what that is. As far as the Taliban are concerned, they have agreed to effectively cut their ties with terrorist groups, although they never use the word. There's nowhere there where it speaks of terrorists. They refuse to have that in the agreement. But supposedly they will not be cooperating with any groups that have the desire to use Afghanistan as a launching pad for attacks on any countries. Again, it's very vague. As far as the takeaways here, it seemed very clear to me that all the give was on the U.S. part. The Taliban have yielded on nothing that we know of any importance. And I think that that's maybe very important for the future of negotiations with the Taliban. They may very well have agreed in those secret agreements, particularly to the one thing that would represent a concession on their part. If they do agree to allow a contingent of American forces, special forces, presumably to remain in the country for counterterrorism purposes. But there's mixed views on just what has been agreed to there, so we'll just have to wait and see. But I think the major takeaway is that the Taliban have pretty much gotten what they wanted, paying very little in exchange.
Michael, what's likely to happen to the gains made over the last 18 years in key areas like human rights and women's rights? And do you think the U.S. did enough to protect them while it was negotiating the deal?
Well, no, the U.S. certainly did not do enough to protect human rights and women's rights, but that was really by design. This US-Taliban deal was not meant to focus on issues like human rights and women's rights. The U.S. government had been very transparent about that from the start, that issues about society and politics in Afghanistan would be hashed out in a intra-Afghan dialogue meant to come after the US-Taliban deal. And so as Marvin has laid out, the actual focus of the US-Taliban deal was fairly narrow, looking at issues of troop withdrawals and the Taliban's relationship to international terror groups. Now, ideally, issues of rights, human rights and women's rights, especially since there had indeed been significant advances in recent years, ideally those issues would have been covered in this US-Taliban agreement. But, quite frankly, the U.S. didn't really have the leverage to push for those issues to be featured in the negotiations leading to the deal with the Taliban. And it didn't have the time either. As we know, the Trump administration, particularly President Trump, have been in a rush to get a deal with the Taliban to provide some type of political cover to the administration to begin a pullout of most, if not all, U.S. troops. Taliban, of course, was not in any rush to get a deal. Those dynamics were such that I think the U.S. wanted to focus on the issues that it knew the Taliban would be most amenable to negotiating. the main one being the issue of a troop withdrawal. But I think that the big factor to weigh here when looking at this question of what risks there could be to human rights in Afghanistan, women's rights in Afghanistan, as this peace and reconciliation process moves forward, if it moves forward, is what kind of Taliban are we really looking at here? Are we looking at the Afghan Taliban of the late 1990s when it controlled the country and when you had a horrific state of affairs when it came to issues of women's rights? Or, as some argue, is this a more modest, a more moderate Taliban, a Taliban 2.0 that would be willing to look more favorably upon the issue of women's rights and would be willing to negotiate, if it were to be in a negotiation with the Afghan government, agree to some baseline or some type of template that allows guarantees for women's rights? Now, given the track record of the Taliban up to this point, I'm not sure that I trust that it is this notion of a Taliban 2.0, a more moderate version of what it used to be. But ultimately, I think the jury is still out.
It's been about 3 weeks now since the deal was signed, and several major challenges have already cropped up, starting with the issue of prisoner exchange. Vanda, is it fair to say that the U.S. was bargaining with the Afghan government's chips by promising to release Taliban prisoners in the first place, given that Kabul wasn't even party to the negotiations?
It is fair to say so, but before I get to the point, I would like to respond to some of the comments made by Marvin and Michael, very important comments, and emphasize that beyond the Trump administration timeline withdrawals, we need to take into consideration the longer history of U.S. efforts to negotiate with the Taliban that really go back to the Obama administration, where in the initial phase of the negotiations, there was effort to negotiate a much more capacious agreement that would indeed focus on issues such as women's rights. Remember Secretary Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the time, arguing that any negotiations would need to have 3 preconditions: women's rights, the preservation of Afghan constitution, as well as the severing of Taliban's relations with Al-Qaeda. And those preconditions, those negotiations efforts didn't get anywhere. They were stuck dead in water. And years of military effort afterwards were not able to shift the Taliban's position. So the U.S. started substantially coming down from what its initial objectives for the negotiations were long before the Trump administration came in. Similarly, with the controversial issue, and here it gets to responding to your question, Alistair, about what is the role of the Afghan government in this and what are the Afghan government chips versus U.S. chips. Long in the initial efforts, the emphasis was on the Taliban negotiating with the Afghan government and the U.S. being in the background. And the Taliban flat refused during the Obama administration, during the many efforts early on to get those negotiations going. Also, that other third parties, such as Scandinavian governments, sought to negotiate. The Taliban understood that the primary military heft is that of the United States, and that it wants to negotiate with the United States the removal of U.S. forces as its primary objective, because that would give it a key leverage in the intra-Afghan negotiations, in addition to the Taliban refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the Afghan government. So now, with respect to the prisoner exchange, indeed, we don't know great amount of details. As Marvin pointed out, the negotiations between the U.S. negotiating team and the Taliban were held very close to the chest, so much so that even the Afghan government felt constantly that they did not know what was happening. And still groping today for what are the secret annexes, what are other elements. But it appears that there was a substantial promise made by the U.S. negotiating team to the Taliban that Taliban prisoners would be released. It's something that was bound to be controversial. The Afghan government has disliked the negotiations very strongly. It has tried to sabotage them or prevent them all along, including very late in January, very late in February, reaching out, for example, to the government of India to somehow stop or prevent the negotiations, and putting out late in fall a negotiations plan that was completely detached from what the US was doing. The Afghan government also understands that the Taliban prisoners are one of the few sources of leverage that it has with the Taliban, not just in the immediate moment, but particularly as US forces start substantially withdrawing or have already substantially withdrawn. So if we forward to November, December of next year and of this year, and particularly spring of next year, the military effort of the Afghan government will be very substantially weakened. It's really been US forces, US air power that has kept the Taliban from being able to take over provincial capitals, hold on to cities, and that has also limited the already very substantial damage that the Taliban inflicts on Afghan security forces. And so at a time of great weakness, the forthcoming great weakness of Afghan security forces, holding on to prisoners will be one of the few sources of leverage that the Afghan government has. Now, the negotiations over the prisoners has been multi-sided, not simply between the US and the Taliban and the Afghan government, but also between the government of President Ghani and the US, with President Ashraf Ghani using his agreement, his consenting to release at least some of the Taliban prisoners as a mechanism to obtain support from the United States for his inauguration, for the US government to recognize that he was in fact the true elected president of Afghanistan as opposed to his chief rival, Dr. Abdullah. And when the US granted that, and US officials such as Ambassador Khalilzad and General Miller showed up at President Ghani's inauguration, it was at that point when President Ghani agreed to release some of the prisoners. Although that agreement has since fallen apart, the Taliban did not like what Ghani brought to the table, and Ghani, for a variety of reasons, has also rescinded that offer. If I make one final comment that pertains to the issue of women. I spent a few weeks in Afghanistan in October and November and had extensive conversations with a variety of Taliban and Taliban-linked interlocutors about what kind of vision they have for the country in the negotiations and beyond, including the role of women. And I want to endorse what Michael said, namely that there are different facets to the Taliban, and it is not yet clear which facet will play what role. You have some Taliban members who will say that women can even be ministers, but they absolutely cannot be head of state. You have other Taliban members that have far more restrictive view of women's role. And they might agree that women should obtain education, but very much believe, like do countries in the Middle East, such as the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, that once women get education and they get married, they should stop having any kind of public role, or it should be up to the husband who decides what kind of role women have. I think it's fairly clear that when the Taliban, when the Taliban is in power in Afghanistan, the restrictions for women will be substantial. But I would also be very surprised if the restrictions and brutality approached anything what we saw in the 1990s.
Marvin, another major issue is the ongoing level of violence that we've seen in Afghanistan. Shortly after signing the deal with the U.S., the Taliban resumed attacks on Afghan forces and maintained a pretty steady tempo since then. Given that violence seems to be one of the Taliban's main tools of leverage, is there any reason to expect them to dial it back now, regardless of what the U.S. may say?
Of course, the Taliban never agreed to a ceasefire. So we had every reason to believe that there was going to be a resumption of violence. The real question is, how can the Taliban calibrate that violence such that they're able to keep their troops in the field busy, avoiding defections and desertions, because that is a concern that they have, that if they let them have much freedom here, they may lose their fighting will. So the calibration here is to have enough of a campaign going that they can avoid the downside of it, but at the same time not overstep such that they make it very difficult for the United States to follow through on the agreement. Now, the advantage that they have is knowing how desperately the United States wants to get out. This gives them, therefore, quite a wide latitude of action. And I think that now what we'll see is very much what we have seen now. We probably won't see the spectacular suicide attacks, but the general level of the campaign, especially as it enters now the spring and the summer, is going to be steady. And as I predict, the U.S. will nevertheless continue its withdrawal beyond the 8,600 or so that supposedly is the first trench here in the withdrawal agreement.
Very quickly, I agree with what Marvin says there. I think just to add sort of an indication of just how different things could be if the Taliban didn't have more leverage. If you could get the Taliban to agree to some type of reduction in violence, and certainly a ceasefire going into potential intra-Afghan dialogue, that would be a really significant confidence building measure. And I think it would really allow for a better environment for talks. And we know that the environment is very tricky as it is. So I think it's really another loss and an indication of how the asymmetry of the negotiating structure, where the Taliban has had so much leverage from the start, that really makes it difficult to create a more favorable environment previously for the U.S. government, and now looking to a potential intra-Afghan dialogue, the Afghan government. And finally, just very quickly, wanted to go back to the discussion on the prisoner release issue that Vanda had laid out very well. One point that I think is important to note, sort of underscores just how tricky this pre-negotiation leading to the negotiations, this issue of the prisoner release would be. The Taliban has been saying all along that its deal with the U.S. stipulates that all prisoners have to be released before intra-Afghan dialogues talk, and before intra-Afghan dialogue begins, and the Taliban has said it will not begin talks with the Afghan government until that happens. If you look closely at the text of the US-Taliban deal, it doesn't actually say that. It says that up to 5,000 prisoners should be released. But the bottom line here is that, again, given the Taliban's leverage, it's difficult for the U.S. And really certainly the Afghan government to push back against that.
Vanda, the results of Afghanistan's presidential election, as you referred to earlier, held last September, are in dispute. And 2 weeks ago, both Ashraf Ghani, the winner, and Abdullah, the runner-up, held parallel inauguration ceremonies. What do you see as the prospects for resolving this political power struggle?
The political power struggle really fundamentally jeopardizes the negotiations with the Taliban, and particularly negotiations that coincides in some way with the time frame of U.S. withdrawal. Let's remember that the deal doesn't say that the U.S. will stop the withdrawal of its forces until there is some sort of deal reached. In fact, it is extremely unlikely that any kind of deal could be reached in 14 months. Negotiations in other countries that took place under much more auspicious conditions for the government, with much weaker opponent, such as in Colombia with the leftist armed group, the FARC, to which the Afghan government frequently refers to, took 4 years. and really more than 4 years. The pre-negotiation phase went even 2 years prior to the 4 years of actual negotiations. In very many other countries, 3 to 6 years is sort of the low range of negotiations, and it can be much longer than that. So under very auspicious circumstances, 14 months of withdrawal really is mismatched with the length of the negotiations. Now, on top of that, those 14 months are ticking while there is a disputed government in Afghanistan. And the longer this dispute goes on, the more the Taliban gains, not merely on the battlefield, but in very many other ways. Even prior to the inauguration of President Ashraf Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, who also considers himself to be a president of Afghanistan, the Taliban had been having many negotiations with different Afghan power brokers. Back in the fall, there were strong efforts by the camp of Abdullah to cancel the electoral process at that point and have, in fact, an interim government in which the Taliban would be part of and in which the Abdullah camp would play a significant role. There were, in fact, even on the US side of negotiations in the summer, great concerns about the fact that the elections were likely to result precisely in the kind of political morass and political crisis moment that it brought about, and that maybe not holding the elections would have been preferable. So the Taliban has well been aware of these dynamics and has used them to lead its own separate negotiations with just about every significant political power broker and politician in Afghanistan, but the Ghani government. Now, apparently, there is some movement forward between President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah. There has been very significant effort by the United States to bring the two sides together, although nothing so far on the scope of Secretary Kerry parachuting to Afghanistan in 2014 to broker what then became the Government of National Unity. In fact, Government of National Disunity. But the latest is that the President Ghani has agreed to bring significant power brokers from within Abdullah's camp into his cabinet and give them cabinet positions as a way to get Abdullah to back off from his claim that he is also a president of Afghanistan. And the big issue is now whether Dr. Abdullah will himself have a role again in the government. Previously, both he and President Ghani have rejected the option that he would continue serving as the extra-constitutional chief of executive, a role that really became very contested and, in fact, emasculated as the previous government went on. But the current crisis over the elections is really just a preview, in my view, of a much more complicated lack of unity in the Afghan political system and brinkmanship that will threaten the negotiations for a long time to come, particularly as the negotiations drag on beyond the 14 months and head into much longer period, with many possibilities that some politicians might attempt to stage a coup d'etat, that the Afghan military may split, that the Afghan military or parts of the Afghan military may object to a particular deal that is reached and rebel against it, such as against any notions that the Taliban would be integrated into the Afghan military, or that a politicians or set of politicians announce their own separate deal with the Taliban and form a government with the Taliban as future parallel government in addition to the formal government. So these current problems really, unfortunately, can very well be merely a preview of what will plague the negotiations and, again, significantly strengthen the hand of the Taliban and jeopardize very political stability in Afghanistan, significantly augmenting chances for civil war.
The other major variable at play here that we haven't discussed at all, and of course, given that we're all kind of on virtual lockdown here in DC, it seems particularly relevant, is the impact of the coronavirus outbreak. Michael, I'm curious to get your thoughts on what kind of impact that's likely to have on Afghanistan writ large, but also on the prospects for the peace process and the intra-Afghan dialogue.
I think it could have a significant impact, and indeed not just on the dialogue, which I'll get into in a second, but also for Afghanistan on the whole. I mean, we know that Afghanistan is a country that struggles under ordinary circumstances to deliver basic services, including healthcare, to those that need it. So clearly, this will be a major challenge for the government. I mean, Afghanistan's location is also significant in that it borders Iran, one of the hardest hit countries, and every day you've got traffic, you've got transit between Iran and Afghanistan. And if you want to reference the Afghan refugees that have been in Iran for a number of years, many have gone back to Afghanistan, some recently. So clearly there are all kinds of risks for Afghanistan on the whole. Certainly, I do fear that the coronavirus outbreak could have a deleterious impact on prospects for peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan for several reasons. One is that certainly above everything else, you have a major bandwidth issue. The Afghan government, for good reason, will have to prioritize its focus on dealing with the coronavirus to try to do what it can to stop it from spreading around the country, which will take resources and a lot of policy space away from the already challenging effort to kickstart some type of intra-Afghan dialogue. Also, with the restrictions on travel and all of that, I think it could just be very difficult to physically get negotiators, Taliban reps to wherever they have to go to start an intra-Afghan dialogue. So even if everything else is done, even if you manage to get a negotiating team established from the government side, which given the lack of political unity in the Afghan political system that Vanda mentioned, even if you do that, even if you get that, once everyone is ready to go, it may be difficult to get to the neutral spot to hold the talks. Though, of course, you could argue, if you want to look at this with a glass half full, if you do manage to get negotiators to the spot, whether it's Norway, wherever we're talking about an intra-Afghan dialogue, you could use the coronavirus as an excuse. Say, well, look, it's not safe to be traveling now, so we're going to keep you here for a long time so that there's plenty of time to negotiate. But one more point to point out, if the coronavirus in Afghanistan really spreads, if it becomes really serious, I think there could be potential implications for the U.S. Troop posture in Afghanistan. We know that President Trump wants to start removing troops, and certainly U.S. troops in Afghanistan would be obviously susceptible to coronavirus if the virus spreads. Could that prompt President Trump to try to accelerate a withdrawal of troops for reasons separate from the progress of intra-Afghan talks or for the various conditions laid out in the US-Taliban agreement necessary for U.S. withdrawal? It's sort of a question to throw out there. But yeah, unfortunately, given that there are already so many constraints to launching an intra-Afghan dialogue, from the lack of political unity in the Afghan political system to this very specific issue of the Taliban prisoner release, this is the worst possible time to have an even bigger obstacle. And yet here it is with the coronavirus.
We're running a bit short on time, but before we wrap up, I wanted to get all of your kind of concluding thoughts on where you see things going from here. Starting with you, Marvin, what will you be keeping a close eye on over the next few months?
It's what we've been talking about consistently through this podcast, and that is what's going to happen if and when there is a dialogue, because that at the moment, as we've indicated, is not guaranteed. But assuming there is, where does that go? Is it just going to be something which is strung out over a long period of time in which there is a reason for both sides to stay at the table, but nothing that could be defined as progress? Meanwhile, what's going on, of course, is in the field, there's still a war going on. And I might add to that, with respect to the virus, we haven't discussed what the impact would be on the war itself, were the virus really to get a grip on the entire society. would this reduce the violence? Would this, because of so many people debilitated, or would this leave the cities particularly vulnerable for a Taliban attack? All that is up in the air. So I think my takeaway here is that we're looking at a process where we know that the odds of it succeeding are limited, because every indication we have here is the Taliban are going to stand firm in wanting something which resembles an Islamic emirate, and that the government has a very different vision of what the political system, the constitutional system should look like in Afghanistan. And how you somehow resolve those two, I think, is going to be very much on everybody's minds.
Vanda, how about you? Where do you see things going from here?
Well, unfortunately, things can go in very many directions. The Afghan government still clings to the view that it hopes to have negotiations like it had with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, essentially amnesty in exchange for the ability to campaign in politics. Or if it cannot get that maximalist objective, it hopes for something like the Colombia negotiations. In my view, those are extremely optimistic and very unlikely modalities of how the negotiations will head forward. Instead, as I posited, I can imagine negotiations that go on for years and involve constantly substantial fighting that might wane at various points, that might be upped later, but that nonetheless in one form or another continues. And as the battlefield dynamics change, deals might be reached, but they might not necessarily be able to hold. And potentially a scenario is indeed very vicious, very difficult civil war. Whether we get to one of these or other scenarios, what is the range of the scenarios and which one it will end up being, in my view, depends on several things, which is the things I'll be looking for. One is, will the Afghan security forces be able to hold together? Both in the sense that the various police, military forces will not be reaching their own separate accommodation deals with the Taliban, which they are doing already, that people will not go AWOL, but also that entire units will not defect along with their political commanders. Will the Afghan political class be able to come together for once? Or will it continue putting ahead its parochial interests and constant preference for endless politicking and crisis-making and brinkmanship ahead of national interests at the moment of really fundamental redesigning of the political dispensation in Afghanistan that the country has enjoyed since 2002. And during my phone negotiations conversations with many of the Afghan political power brokers, I was really struck by how many of them believed that they can make a fine deal with the Taliban, and that even if the Taliban becomes the dominant actor in power, the dominant, if not sole power, that the Taliban will need them to rule. And so even if the national effort fails, they will still be fine. That attitude, in my view, is extremely dangerous and really bodes far worse for issues such as human rights or women's rights than even what the United States negotiated with the Taliban. And finally, I'll be looking at how the Taliban is holding together, both in the way that Marvin referred to it. Will Taliban units that are tired and exhausted and have been fighting for a long time defect, but also in the larger sense of whether what the top leadership, Quetta Shura, Peshawar Shura, etc., negotiates with Afghan government and Afghan power brokers, whether that will sufficiently satisfy middle-level commanders or whether splits will emerge along those lines.
Michael, you've got the last word. Any final thoughts?
Sure. I'll be very brief. Two quick issues. One, in terms of markers, I'm going to be looking to see what happens with this Taliban prisoner release issue. I mean, if that is somehow resolved in the next few weeks or so, then I think there's hope. But if it's not, and it keeps dragging out over the next few months, and you can't even get the intra-Afghan talks process off the ground because the Taliban refuses to start them until the prisoner release issue is addressed, then I think you really have to be skeptical about any chances of launching a peace process in Afghanistan. Secondly, I think it's important to keep in mind that the biggest decision about this whole war in Afghanistan to date will be made by the next U.S. president, by not the current administration, but the next one. It's 2021. That is when the U.S. government will need to decide if the Taliban has fulfilled its commitments to the deal it made with the U.S., thereby allowing the U.S. to undertake the full and complete withdrawal of American troops. So you could argue that this U.S.-Taliban deal, given the timeline, sort of kicks the can down the road and gives the opportunity to the next administration, whether that's Trump administration part 2 or another administration. So that's sort of another reason why it just highlights that whoever is sitting in the White House when we get to, say, March, April, May of 2021 is going to have to make a pretty significant decision, perhaps the most consequential decision so far, about the U.S. effort and the U.S. role and its policy in Afghanistan.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but Marvin, Vanda, Michael, thank you all for joining the podcast today. And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.